September 1942. Willow Run, Michigan. Soviet Colonel Mikhail Belyaev stood at the observation platform overlooking Ford's bomber assembly line and watched something impossible. A B-24 Liberator, 4 engines, 110-foot wingspan, 18 tons of aluminum and steel, rolled off the production line and taxied toward the airfield. His translator, a young American lieutenant, said matter-of-factly, "Another plane completed." Belyaev nodded. 1 bomber per day was impressive. The Germans managed similar rates at their best factories. Then the translator continued. "They're running 63-minute intervals now. Mr. Ford expects to hit 1 per hour by spring." Belyaev's English was adequate for technical discussions. He understood the words. He simply couldn't reconcile them with reality. 1 bomber every 63 minutes meant over 15 aircraft daily. That exceeded the monthly output of the Kazan aviation factory, which Belyaev had helped establish in 1939. The Kazan plant employed 12,000 workers and was considered one of the Soviet Union's premier aviation facilities. Willow Run employed 42,000 workers. The building stretched 1 mile from end to end, covering 3.5 million square feet under a single roof. The assembly line moved continuously. Components arrived from feeder lines and were attached to airframes as they progressed through the facility. Belyaev had studied American mass production techniques before the war. He had read Henry Ford's writings on assembly line manufacturing. Reading about it and witnessing it were entirely different experiences. The Soviet delegation had arrived in America 6 weeks earlier under the Lend-Lease program. The United States was shipping weapons and equipment to the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted Soviet officers to observe American production firsthand, to verify capabilities, to assess quality, and to learn methods that might be adapted to Soviet industry. The delegation included 8 officers, aviation specialists, tank designers, artillery experts, and industrial engineers. All were experienced. All held rank. All had been briefed in Moscow on American production statistics. Those statistics had seemed exaggerated. Perhaps American propaganda meant to impress allies. Soviet intelligence suggested the numbers were inflated by a factor of 2 or 3. Belyaev had assumed the truth lay somewhere between Soviet capabilities and American claims. Now he stood watching the 16th B-24 of the day emerge from the assembly line. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. The plant operated 3 shifts. Production continued around the clock. Simple mathematics suggested 40 to 50 bombers daily when the facility reached full capacity. The entire Soviet aviation industry had produced 15,735 aircraft in 1942, including fighters, bombers, and trainers. Willow Run alone projected the output of 8,685 B-24 Liberators during the war years. 1 American factory, producing 1 aircraft type, would manufacture more than half the total Soviet aircraft production. Belyaev descended from the observation platform and walked the assembly line floor with his translator and an engineer from Ford. The noise was overwhelming. Rivet guns, metal presses, engine tests, continuous mechanical activity. Workers moved with practiced efficiency. Each station performed specific tasks. Wings attached here, landing gear installed there, electrical systems connected at the next position. The standardization impressed Belyaev more than the speed. Every component was interchangeable. Any B-24 part fit any B-24 airframe. Soviet aircraft manufacturing relied heavily on hand fitting. Mechanics adjusted components to match specific airframes. Field repairs required skilled technicians who could modify parts. American standardization meant a mechanic with basic training could replace any component with a spare part and expect perfect fit. The Ford engineer explained the supply chain. Over 1,500 companies across America manufactured components for the B-24. Engines from Chevrolet in Tonawanda, New York, propellers from Curtiss in Caldwell, New Jersey, instruments from dozens of specialized firms. All arrived at Willow Run with precise specifications. Ford's role was final assembly and coordination. The engineer showed Belyaev quality control stations. Inspectors rejected components for deviations measuring thousandths of an inch. Rejected parts were scrapped or returned to manufacturers. Soviet factories operated under different constraints. Production quotas mattered more than precision. Parts that functioned adequately were acceptable. The American insistence on perfection seemed wasteful until Belyaev considered maintenance implications. Standardized, precision-manufactured components simplified logistics and reduced maintenance time. That evening, the delegation gathered at their Detroit hotel. Belyaev drafted a report for Moscow. He described Willow Run's dimensions, production rates, and workforce size. He included comparative analysis with Soviet aviation plants. The report would be transmitted through diplomatic cables to the Soviet Purchasing Commission in Washington, then forwarded to Moscow. Belyaev anticipated skepticism. The numbers contradicted everything Soviet industrial planning assumed about production limitations. A single American facility outproducing entire Soviet industrial sectors seemed impossible. Yet Belyaev had witnessed it. He had walked the assembly line. He had counted aircraft. He had studied the systems and processes. The bomber plant was just the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, the Soviet delegation would witness production that made Willow Run seem modest. October 1942, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Volkov watched molten steel pour from a blast furnace at the Edgar Thompson Works and understood why American production seemed limitless. The furnace stood 12 stories tall. The pour lasted 47 minutes. Orange-white liquid metal flowed into massive ladles, each holding 275 tons. The heat was intense, even from the observation platform 50 yards away. Volkov had visited Soviet steel mills. He had overseen metallurgical operations at Magnitogorsk, the pride of Soviet industrialization. Nothing he had seen in the Soviet Union compared to the scale of American steel production. Volkov specialized in metallurgy. Before the war, he had studied at the Moscow Steel and Alloys Institute. He had published papers on blast furnace efficiency. Steel production was the foundation of industrial power, and the Soviet Union had made enormous strides during the 1930s. Soviet propaganda celebrated surpassing capitalist production. Volkov knew the real numbers. In 1943, the Soviet Union would produce 8.5 million tons of steel. Respectable output, especially under wartime conditions with German forces occupying major industrial regions. The United States produced 85 million tons of steel that same year, 10 times Soviet output. Volkov had assumed American statistics were inflated. Now he stood watching one facility process more steel monthly than entire Soviet regions produced annually. The delegation traveled to Gary, Indiana, to tour the Gary Works, United States Steel's largest facility. The complex covered 1,500 acres along Lake Michigan. The plant included 14 blast furnaces, 10 open hearth furnaces, and multiple rolling mills. Daily production exceeded 15,000 tons of finished steel. Volkov walked through the facility with American engineers who explained continuous processing. Ore arrived by ship from Minnesota's Mesabi Range. Trains delivered coal from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The furnaces operated without interruption. One furnace had run continuously for 7 years. Soviet furnaces required frequent shutdowns for maintenance and repairs. American engineering minimized downtime through superior materials and systematic maintenance schedules. Quality standards shocked Volkov more than quantity. At the rolling mills, he observed steel plate inspection. Inspectors rejected material for minor surface imperfections that Soviet plants would consider acceptable. The rejected steel was recycled, melted down, and reprocessed. American steel production operated with margins that permitted waste. Soviet production operated at capacity with no buffer for quality rejection. Every ton of steel mattered. Defective material was used anyway because replacement wasn't available. The American guide explained transportation infrastructure. Railroads moved finished steel across the continent in days. The United States operated 227,000 miles of railroad track, all standardized gauge. Electrification was common on major routes. Soviet railroads covered 60,000 miles, much of it single track with limited capacity. Soviet rail gauge differed from European gauge, requiring cargo transfers at borders. American logistics functioned seamlessly. Steel produced in Pennsylvania arrived in California shipyards within a week. From Gary, the delegation traveled to Richmond, California, to visit Kaiser shipyards. Henry Kaiser had revolutionized ship construction using prefabrication techniques and assembly line methods adapted from automobile manufacturing. The Richmond yards built Liberty ships, 441-foot cargo vessels designed for rapid mass production. Each ship required approximately 10,000 tons of steel. Traditional shipbuilding took months. Kaiser's yards completed Liberty ships in 45 days on average. The record stood at 4 days and 15 hours, established in November 1942, when the Robert E. Peary was launched from keel laying to launch in less than 5 days. Volkov watched multiple ships under construction simultaneously. The yards operated around the clock. Prefabricated sections arrived from workshops and were welded into place. Women comprised significant portions of the workforce, welding, riveting, and operating cranes. Soviet women worked in factories, but Kaiser's systematic training programs and equal pay policies differed from Soviet labor practices. American workers were better fed, better housed, and produced more per labor hour than their Soviet counterparts. The mathematics accumulated in Volkov's reports. The United States would build 2,710 Liberty ships during the war. Each ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo. The merchant fleet enabled simultaneous supply of American forces in Europe and the Pacific while maintaining Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union and Britain. Soviet merchant capacity was negligible by comparison. The USSR depended entirely on Allied shipping for supply routes through Murmansk and the Persian Gulf. Steel production enabled everything else. Warships required steel. Aircraft factories required steel for tools and machinery. Tank production consumed steel. American abundance meant simultaneous production across all categories without competition for resources. Soviet planners constantly juggled priorities. Steel allocated to tank production meant less steel for artillery. Ammunition production competed with small arms manufacturing. American production operated without such constraints. At night, Volkov reviewed statistics. American steel production in 1 month exceeded total Soviet annual capacity. The implications were strategic. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union partly to capture Ukrainian industrial regions and Caucasus resources. German planners understood that controlling Soviet production centers would cripple resistance. American production was distributed, redundant, and impossible to attack. Even if hypothetical enemies destroyed Pittsburgh's mills, dozens of other facilities maintained production. The Soviet Union concentrated production in vulnerable locations by necessity. American geography and industrial development provided inherent strategic advantages. If steel was America's skeleton, petroleum was its bloodstream, and the Soviets were about to discover an ocean of it. November 1942, East Texas oil field. Major Grigory Semenov stood beside an oil derrick and watched natural gas burn from a flare stack. The flame reached 30 feet into the sky. It had burned continuously for months. The American petroleum engineer explained that capturing the gas wasn't economically viable at current prices. Better to flare it than build infrastructure for a low-value product. Semenov calculated quickly. The amount of natural gas being burned as waste exceeded the total gas production of several Soviet regions. This wasn't conservation. This abundance was so extreme that valuable resources could be discarded. Semenov had worked in the Baku oil fields since 1935. Azerbaijan provided most Soviet petroleum. The fields were old, discovered in the 19th century, and production was declining. Every liter of fuel mattered. German armies had driven toward the Caucasus specifically to capture Soviet oil production. Without fuel, tanks couldn't move, aircraft couldn't fly, and trucks couldn't transport supplies. The Red Army fought desperately to protect Baku because losing it meant losing the war. Now Semenov stood in Texas watching Americans burn fuel they considered worthless. The East Texas oil field stretched across 140,000 acres. Discovered in 1930, it was the largest oil field in the United States at the time. Daily production exceeded 600,000 barrels. One field in Texas produced more petroleum than the entire Soviet Union. American oil production in 1943 reached 1.5 billion barrels. Soviet production that same year was 18 million barrels. The ratio was 83-1. Semenov had been briefed on these numbers in Moscow. He had assumed they were errors or propaganda. American production couldn't possibly be 80 times larger. Soviet planners would have known. Stalin would have understood the implications. Yet here stood Semenov, watching proof that the numbers were accurate, possibly understated. The delegation visited drilling operations. American crews drilled wells faster than Soviet teams. Rotary drilling technology, superior drill bits, and experienced crews meant wells reached production in days rather than weeks. The Americans drilled exploratory wells constantly, searching for new fields. Soviet drilling focused on known reserves. Exploration was limited by equipment shortages and other priorities. American companies competed to find oil. Competition drove innovation and efficiency. Soviet oil production followed state plans that emphasized meeting quotas over improving techniques. From the oil fields, the delegation traveled to Port Arthur, Texas, to tour Gulf Oil's refinery. The facility processed 50,000 barrels of crude oil daily. The refinery produced multiple grades of gasoline, diesel fuel, lubricants, and petroleum products. Most importantly, it produced high-octane aviation fuel through catalytic cracking, a process Soviet refineries had not yet mastered. American aircraft ran on 100-octane fuel as standard. Soviet aircraft used 74-octane fuel on average, with 91-octane considered premium fuel reserved for critical missions. The quality difference affected engine performance, altitude capability, and combat effectiveness. Semenov watched the refinery operations with growing unease. The technology gap was wider than Soviet leadership understood. American petroleum infrastructure was decades ahead. Soviet refineries produced fuel. American refineries produced exactly the fuel needed for specific applications in vast quantities with consistent quality. The refinery Semenov toured was one of dozens across the United States. Each operated at similar capacity. Total American refining capacity exceeded Soviet capacity by orders of magnitude. The waste continued to disturb him. Petroleum products that didn't meet specifications were reprocessed or discarded. Soviet refineries used everything. Substandard fuel went to less critical applications. Nothing was wasted because nothing was abundant. American abundance permitted quality control that guaranteed performance. Soviet scarcity meant accepting whatever quality could be achieved. Transportation infrastructure amplified production advantages. Pipelines moved oil from fields to refineries to distribution points. Tank trucks delivered fuel to airports and military bases. Railroad tank cars carried petroleum across the continent. The system functioned with minimal bottlenecks. Soviet fuel distribution relied heavily on rail transport with limited pipeline infrastructure. Fuel shortages occurred not from lack of production, but from transportation failures. American logistics ensured fuel reached where it was needed. The strategic implications haunted Semenov. Mechanized warfare depended on fuel. German armies had advanced rapidly in 1941, partly because they captured Soviet fuel depots. Soviet counteroffensives stalled when fuel ran short. American fuel production could supply both American forces fighting globally and provide Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. The United States would send 2.6 million tons of petroleum products to the USSR during the war. This represented a small fraction of American production, but transformed Soviet logistics. Red Army trucks ran on American fuel. Soviet aircraft flew on American high-octane gasoline. Without Lend-Lease fuel, Soviet mobile operations would have been impossible. Semenov drafted careful reports. He documented production figures, refinery capacity, and quality standards. He noted technological gaps and infrastructure differences. The reports would reach Moscow through diplomatic channels. Semenov wondered how Stalin would react to learning that American fuel production exceeded Soviet production by 83-1. Perhaps Soviet leadership already knew. Perhaps they had known all along and never shared the information with lower-level officials like Semenov. The fuel-powered factories. The factories built machines. And the machine production would shatter every assumption about industrial warfare. December 1942. Detroit, Michigan. Colonel Ivan Kravchenko watched M4 Sherman tanks roll off the Chrysler Tank Arsenal assembly line and confronted a puzzle he couldn't solve. Kravchenko had helped design the T-34, the Soviet tank that shocked German forces with its sloped armor and wide tracks. He understood tank production intimately. He knew the T-34 was superior to the Sherman in armor protection and main gun performance. Yet watching American production, Kravchenko realized quality comparisons missed the essential point. America wasn't trying to build the best tank. America was building everything simultaneously. The Chrysler Arsenal occupied 113 acres in Warren, Michigan. The facility had been constructed in 18 months starting in 1940. Production began in April 1941. By December 1942, the plant produced 1,000 Sherman tanks monthly. Workers operated in 2 shifts. The assembly line moved continuously. Kravchenko walked the factory floor, observing welding operations, turret installation, and engine mounting. The process resembled automobile assembly adapted for military vehicles. Each station performed specific tasks. Quality inspectors checked work at multiple points. Tanks that failed inspection were pulled from the line for rework or component replacement. American production statistics revealed the scope. The United States would produce 88,410 tanks during the war years. Soviet production would reach 105,251 tanks, actually exceeding American output. Kravchenko had been briefed on these numbers before leaving Moscow. Soviet propagandists celebrated outproducing America in tank manufacturing. The celebration missed the context. The Soviet Union focused nearly all industrial capacity on military production. Civilian manufacturing had been eliminated. Every factory, every worker, every ton of steel went toward defeating Germany. The United States produced 88,410 tanks, while simultaneously manufacturing everything else. The everything else changed strategic calculations. American factories produced 2.4 million military trucks during the war. Soviet factories produced 265,000 trucks. The disparity was 9-1. Tanks without trucks couldn't maintain supply lines. Soviet mobile operations depended on Lend-Lease trucks. The United States would send 400,000 trucks to the USSR under Lend-Lease, more than total Soviet production. Red Army mechanized units drove American Studebaker and Dodge trucks. Without them, Soviet offensives would have stalled for lack of logistics. Kravchenko visited the Willys plant in Toledo, Ohio, observing Jeep production. The small, versatile vehicle impressed him more than tanks. Willys would produce 640,000 Jeeps during the war. The Soviet Union had no equivalent vehicle. Soviet forces used motorcycles, trucks, or captured German vehicles for reconnaissance and light transport. The Jeep-filled roles Soviet planners hadn't prioritized because they lacked capacity to address every need. American production addressed every need simultaneously because capacity existed for all requirements. Artillery production followed similar patterns. American factories produced 257,000 artillery pieces during the war. Soviet production exceeded 500,000 pieces, but again, the comparison was misleading. Soviet artillery often meant simple mortars and light guns. American production included heavy artillery, anti-aircraft guns, naval guns, and sophisticated fire control systems. Quality and quantity both mattered. American artillery used proximity fuses, a technological innovation that increased effectiveness dramatically. Soviet artillery relied on contact fuses and time fuses. Small arms production revealed the same pattern. American factories produced over 20 million rifles, 6 million pistols, and 2.6 million submachine guns. Ammunition production reached 41 billion rounds. Soviet production was substantial but couldn't match American output while also producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Every bullet fired by Soviet forces came from production capacity that couldn't be used for other purposes. American soldiers fired ammunition freely because abundance meant conservation wasn't necessary. The delegation toured a gun factory in Springfield, Massachusetts. Workers operated machines that cut, drilled, and shaped metal components. The factory produced M1 Garand rifles, semi-automatic weapons, superior to bolt-action rifles used by most armies. Soviet infantry carried Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifles, reliable weapons, but technologically dated. American infantry carried semi-automatic rifles as standard issue. The productivity difference wasn't worker effort. Soviet workers worked longer hours under harsher conditions. American workers were better fed, better rested, and operated superior machinery that multiplied their output. Quality control procedures troubled Kravchenko. American inspectors rejected weapons for defects Soviet arsenals would consider acceptable. Rejected rifles were scrapped or returned for rework. Soviet production couldn't afford such waste. Weapons that functioned were issued regardless of minor defects. The American insistence on perfection seemed extravagant until Kravchenko considered field performance. Precisely manufactured weapons with interchangeable parts required less maintenance and broke down less frequently. American weapons functioned reliably because manufacturing standards eliminated defects before they reached soldiers. Worker conditions at American factories contrasted sharply with Soviet conditions. American defense plants operated cafeterias serving hot meals. Workers received wages that allowed decent housing and adequate food. Safety standards reduced industrial accidents. Soviet factories operated under wartime urgency with minimal worker amenities. Productivity should have been higher in Soviet plants, where patriotic motivation and state pressure drove effort. Instead, American workers produced 2 to 3 times more per labor hour. Well-fed, well-rested workers in safe conditions outproduced exhausted, hungry workers driven by quotas and fear. Kravchenko's crisis was ideological. Soviet planning emphasized heroic sacrifice and Stakhanovite workers exceeding quotas through revolutionary enthusiasm. American workers weren't heroes. They clocked in, did their jobs, and went home to comfortable houses. Yet they produced more. The contradiction challenged fundamental assumptions about socialist superiority. The weapons and vehicles came from factories, but the factories ran on something the Soviets hadn't fully calculated. The American workers' productivity, powered by abundance, the delegation was about to witness at the consumer level. February 1943. Chicago, Illinois. The Sears Roebuck catalog arrived at the delegation's hotel like a message from another planet. Major Yuri Petrov flipped through 1,500 pages of consumer goods available for purchase during wartime. Clothing, furniture, tools, appliances, toys, sporting goods, musical instruments, jewelry. Every page displayed items that hadn't been available to Soviet civilians in years. Petrov understood military production. Factories converted to war production stopped making civilian goods. This was necessary and inevitable. Except America hadn't stopped. American factories produced bombers and refrigerators simultaneously. The delegation visited a supermarket on Chicago's South Side. Petrov walked the aisles with his translator, both men silent. Shelves were stocked with canned goods, fresh produce, meat, dairy products, bread, and packaged foods. No ration cards were required for most items. Sugar was rationed. Coffee was limited. Meat purchases required coupons. But the shelves held food. Soviet civilians hadn't seen stocked food stores since 1941. German invasion had disrupted agriculture and transportation. Food reached soldiers first. Civilians received rations when available. Bread, potatoes, and cabbage sustained survival. The average Soviet civilian consumed 1,200 to 1,800 calories daily. Malnutrition was common. Starvation occurred in besieged cities like Leningrad. American rationing was theatrical by comparison. The Office of Price Administration limited certain foods to ensure fair distribution and support military needs. But limits meant reduced abundance, not deprivation. The average American consumed 3,300 calories daily during the war. Meat appeared on tables regularly. Milk was standard for children. Fruits and vegetables remained available. American complaints about rationing seemed absurd to Petrov. Americans complained about eating less meat than preferred. Soviets struggled to obtain enough calories to survive. Agricultural production explained the disparity. American farms used tractors, mechanical harvesters, and scientific methods that multiplied yields. The United States had produced over 700,000 farm tractors before and during the early war years. Mechanization meant fewer farmers produced more food. Soviet agriculture relied heavily on manual labor. Tractors existed but numbered around 200,000, many broken or lacking spare parts. German occupation of Ukraine, the Soviet breadbasket, devastated agricultural production. The USSR depended on American food shipments under Lend-Lease to prevent widespread famine. The delegation visited Marshall Field's department store in downtown Chicago, 6 floors of merchandise, clothing for men, women, and children, shoes in multiple styles and sizes, household goods, linens, cookware. Everything was available for purchase with money, no special permissions required, no connections needed. Soviet citizens needed ration cards for clothing. A clothing card might permit 1 pair of shoes annually if shoes were available. Most Soviet families owned minimal clothing and repaired items until they disintegrated. American families owned closets full of clothes and purchased new items regularly. Petrov observed American workers shopping during lunch breaks. Factory workers, office clerks, housewives with children. All seemed adequately dressed. Housing conditions followed similar patterns. The delegation stayed in hotels but drove through residential neighborhoods. Working-class houses had indoor plumbing, electricity, and heating. Most homes had refrigerators and washing machines. Soviet urban housing meant communal apartments with shared kitchens and bathrooms. Private apartments were rare luxuries reserved for important officials. Most Soviet citizens lived in conditions Americans would consider unacceptable poverty. Entertainment continued during wartime. Movie theaters operated throughout Chicago. Restaurants served meals to anyone who could pay. Nightclubs featured music and dancing. Americans treated leisure as normal even during war. Soviet entertainment consisted of patriotic films, radio broadcasts, and state-organized cultural events. Personal entertainment was reading, if books were available, or conversation. The concept of paying money to sit in air-conditioned comfort watching Hollywood films seemed decadent until Petrov reconsidered. Entertainment rested workers. Rested workers produced more. American productivity advantage might stem partly from treating workers as humans rather than production units. Radio ownership illustrated the pattern. American factories produced 13 million radios during war years. Most American households owned radios. Families listened to news, music, comedy shows, and dramas. Soviet radio production was minimal and focused on military communication equipment. Civilian radio ownership was limited. Information came from newspapers and official announcements. American civilians had constant access to information and entertainment. The abundance wasn't wasted. It was an investment in civilian morale and productivity. The delegation attended a symphony orchestra performance at Orchestra Hall. Tickets cost $2. The hall was full. Americans attended cultural events casually during wartime. Soviet culture thrived in certain ways, but attending performances required connections or special circumstances. American culture was democratic. Anyone with modest funds could participate. The economic system enabled experiences Soviet socialism promised but didn't deliver. Consumer spending figures revealed the scope. Americans spent $102 billion on consumer goods in 1943, while simultaneously funding the largest military production in history. The Soviet consumer economy had essentially ceased to exist. Every factory, every resource, every worker focused on military production. The Americans fought a global war on 2 fronts while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded Soviet peacetime conditions. Petrov drafted his most troubling report. American workers produced more because they lived better. The causality ran opposite to Soviet ideology. Soviet theory held that sacrifice and revolutionary discipline created productivity. American practice demonstrated that well-fed, well-housed, adequately compensated workers outproduced their ideologically motivated but materially deprived Soviet counterparts. This wasn't temporary wartime mobilization. This was the baseline American standard of living. The consumer abundance wasn't wasted. It was the foundation. Well-fed workers in stable homes produced the weapons that were winning the war. The final revelation would come when the delegation saw where it all came from, the organizational systems that made abundance possible. April 1943. Chicago Railroad Yards. Colonel Belyaev stood on an observation platform watching freight trains arrive, unload, and depart with mechanical precision. 23 trains moved through the yard simultaneously. Coordination occurred without apparent chaos. American railroads operated 227,000 miles of track, all standardized gauge. Trains moved cargo from coast to coast in days. Soviet railroads covered 60,000 miles, much of it single track with limited capacity. Soviet rail gauge differed from European gauge, requiring cargo transfers at borders. American logistics functioned seamlessly. Soviet logistics struggled constantly with bottlenecks and shortages. The delegation's final weeks focused on understanding how American production was possible. What had been documented exhaustively: aircraft, ships, tanks, steel, petroleum, consumer goods, all produced in quantities that dwarfed Soviet capabilities. The how was more complex. American production wasn't centrally planned in the Soviet sense. The War Production Board coordinated priorities and allocated strategic materials, but thousands of private companies executed production through contracts and subcontracts. Competition drove efficiency. Companies bid for contracts. Better performance meant more contracts. Soviet production followed Gosplan directives. Orders came from Moscow. Factories met quotas or faced consequences. No competition existed because the state owned everything. The delegation visited Northwestern University to observe engineering education. American universities graduate over 50,000 engineers annually. Programs emphasize practical application alongside theoretical knowledge. Students worked in laboratories with modern equipment. Soviet engineering education was rigorous, but fewer graduates emerged annually and practical experience was limited. The American technical workforce was larger, better trained, and more experienced with industrial applications. Education extended beyond universities. American high school graduation rates reached 75% by 1940. Literacy was nearly universal. Technical training programs taught specific skills to workers without university education. Soviet literacy had improved dramatically since the revolution, but still lagged American levels. Educational infrastructure mattered because complex manufacturing required literate, trained workers at every level. Management philosophy differences emerged in factory visits. American managers studied efficiency constantly. Time-motion studies analyzed worker movements to eliminate wasted effort. Worker suggestions for improvements were solicited and sometimes implemented. Production lines were redesigned based on experience. Soviet management emphasized meeting quotas through discipline and exhortation. Stakhanovite workers who exceeded quotas were celebrated as heroes. Systematic process improvement was less common than appeals to patriotic duty. The statistical summary accumulated across 6 months of observation. American aircraft production would exceed 300,000 planes during the war. Soviet production would reach 158,000. American tank production was 88,410, but America also produced everything else. Soviet tank production of 105,251 came at the expense of other production. American truck production was 2.4 million. Soviet production was 265,000. Steel production ratios were 10:1. Oil production was 83:1. Ship construction showed America building more tonnage in 1943 than Japan built during the entire war. The numbers led to uncomfortable conclusions. Soviet industrial achievements during the 1930s had been genuine. Massive factories were built. Production increased dramatically. But American industrial capacity operated at a different scale entirely. 1 year of American production exceeded a decade of Soviet production in most categories. The ratio wasn't 2-1 or even 5-1. It was 10-1, 20-1, in some cases 50-1 or higher. In November 1943, Stalin attended the Tehran Conference with Roosevelt and Churchill. During dinner, Stalin raised his glass in a toast that would be recorded in multiple accounts. To American production, without which this war would have been lost. The words acknowledged what Soviet officers had observed firsthand. Without American production, specifically Lend-Lease supplies, the Soviet Union might not have survived. American trucks motorized the Red Army. American fuel powered Soviet aircraft. American food fed Soviet soldiers. American industrial production sustained Soviet resistance. Soviet officers who witnessed American production wrote detailed reports. Many reports remained classified for decades. Some were declassified after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The reports documented everything the delegation observed. Production figures, factory visits, technological assessments all confirmed that American industrial supremacy was real, not propaganda. Several officers who wrote overly favorable reports faced suspicion upon returning to Moscow. Praising capitalist achievements too enthusiastically could be dangerous. Some officers faced investigation. Others were reassigned to remote positions. The truth they reported was unwelcome. Post-war Soviet industrial policy showed American influence. Soviet planners attempted to copy certain American methods. Standardization improved. Quality control became more systematic. But copying methods without copying systems had limited effect. American productivity stemmed from economic structures, educational systems, worker conditions, and cultural factors that couldn't be replicated through industrial orders. Soviet production improved but never matched American efficiency. The delegation members who survived the war carried knowledge that shaped their understanding of Cold War dynamics. They knew America's industrial capacity firsthand. They had walked American factories. They had seen American abundance. When Cold War tensions escalated and nuclear confrontation seemed possible, Soviet leaders who knew the truth understood that direct military conflict with America was unwinnable. American industrial capacity could outproduce Soviet capacity indefinitely. Nuclear weapons created deterrence, but conventional war would be decided by production, and production favored America overwhelmingly. The knowledge gap was strategic. Soviet leadership knew American capabilities. Soviet people were told that socialism was surpassing capitalism. Propaganda maintained the narrative of Soviet superiority. But those who saw America knew otherwise. The officers returned to Moscow with reports that would be classified for 50 years. They had witnessed production that made Soviet achievements seem primitive. They had seen abundance that made Soviet scarcity look like policy failure rather than temporary wartime sacrifice. Most importantly, they had learned that American industrial supremacy wasn't temporary wartime mobilization. It was the baseline. The system that could produce more in 1 year than the USSR managed in 10 wasn't showing off. It was just Tuesday in America.